Okie doke. Here, let me test something here. There we go, we can hear my voice. Okay, today I wanted to briefly talk about the gradient mesh tool, for which there is no exercise, and there was before. This is the tool right here. It says gradient mesh. Any shape can be turned into a gradient mesh, but as I show you how to use this tool, some shapes work better than others. And you'll see why. The best example that I can think of that we have, there are a couple of them where the gradient mesh is used. One is on my website, and if we look at student artwork, and we scroll down to this car, he used the gradient mesh tool extensively to create all of these subtle gradients. You use this tool specifically when you simply can't use a linear or radial gradient and you need the different colors to go in subtle directions, in subtle little directions. So that's a good one. The other one that we have in the samples file in Illustrator, let me go under the hard drive. This is accessible to everybody too. I look under applications and we look under Adobe Illustrator CS3, cool extras, sample files, sample art, and it's got to be in here somewhere. It is. Crystal Vellum, the flower. Now why can't I open it? Okay, let me try it again. Open. There we go. Flower. And because I do have the original file for this, you can see that each of these shapes is separate. And as I roll over them, notice the mesh, that grid that's on there. That's what a gradient mesh is. That wherever these lines cross, you can put a different color. So the tighter the mesh, the more lines you have, the more intersections, the more colors you can add. Obviously, the more complicated it gets too. And these are all pretty complicated. And you can see that all of these shapes are meshes. So how do you use this tool? So let me set this aside. I'll select this one. And I'm just going to use very basic shapes to show you what works.
Which tool is it?
It's this one right here, gradient mesh tool. So what I can do is I can start, for example, with a circle. And I can choose to fill it with a color or not. It's really not important. And you probably won't want a stroke for it, but it doesn't matter. And then I can either take the tool and I can click on the shape. And wherever I click, there will be an intersection. So if I click here, see? If I click down here, there's an intersection. And it doesn't do anything at the moment because I haven't, where those intersections are, I have not put a different color. It's all the same color. So let me undo for a minute. I'm going to go back to a basic shape. There is another place we can go to convert this to a gradient mesh, and it does it in a slightly different way. You go to Object, and you select Gradient Mesh, Create Gradient Mesh. Now, look at what it does. By default, it selects 4 rows, 4 columns, and the appearance can be to center or to edge. It's up to you, and it just inverts how it places from white, basically from white to red or whatever color you have in there. And that doesn't mean that you cannot add any more mesh to this. If I use the gradient mesh tool, I can, wherever I click, again, it adds more to it. Then what you do with the direct selection tool, and it's advisable, I think, to have under view, have smart guides turned on, so without selecting it, you can see where the crossover is, where each line crosses over. So if I decide and I want to select, let's say, I can select one or I can select multiples by holding down the Shift key. And with these intersections selected, I can now select a different color. And notice how yellow is applied to just that area, and it spreads out smoothly and softly, just like an airbrush or like little drops of pigment in watercolor.
Sorry, when you're selecting those intersections, multiple ones,
I just held down the Shift key, and I'm using the direct selection tool to select individual points. Now, in order to vary this even further, you can go back and you can, when you select on a single anchor point or intersection, just like the pen tool, I can click and I can drag this around, and notice how it pushes the pigment around when you do that. If I click on there and I pull it like so, see how it pushes it around? If you've ever worked with watercolors, you can control the pigment by taking a straw, and while it's still wet, you have a puddle of the pigment in the watercolor, you can blow on it, you can push the pigment in a direction. And that's sort of what you're doing here. What you can also do is that if I want to select this, and rather than, notice that the horizontal and vertical both move. They bend when I move that. What I can also do is by holding down the Command key, or the Control key, and click, no, sorry. I'm going to hold down the Command key. No, I didn't want to do that. Hold on. There we go. Command. No. Oh, I'm sorry. The reason it's not working is I have to make sure that I have the Gradient Mesh tool selected. So let me go back again. Select an individual anchor point. Go back to the Gradient Mesh tool. And now, when I move on top of it, and I hold down the Command key, notice that when I slide it left and right, it's not pulling the horizontal, it's only pulling the vertical one over. Likewise, if I were to pull it down, notice it's only pulling the horizontal and not the vertical. And it changes the way that the spread of the gradient. And again, for every one of these, I can go ahead and I can select crossover, and I can begin to add colors. So that's how the flower is created. That's how the car is created, that it's broken down in individual shapes and colors are added. You can also remove anchor points. If I simply select, or lines, if I select one and I hit the delete key, that's not what I want. Let me go back to here. Let's select the direct selection tool, and I'm going to click over here and select one of these, and I hit delete, and that's not what I want either. Let me try again. Click. There we go. That's not. Oh, there we go. I did. It took both the horizontal and the vertical. Well, I will keep questioning myself now. If I select one of the anchor points and hit delete, see how that one and that vertical one are now gone. Yeah, that's sort of, well, roll over it, and I have some too. Now, what you can also do with the Gradient Mesh tool selected, I can roll over a horizontal and I can hold down the Option key and I can click, and notice it's just getting rid of the horizontal lines. It's not getting rid of the vertical ones. If you don't do that, if you don't have the Gradient Mesh tool selected and you don't and you delete, it deletes both vertical and horizontal. If you have the Gradient Mesh tool selected and you roll over a line, hold down the Option key, you see the minus sign, and it removes just that. So now, when I use the direct selection tool, and I select one here, one of the anchor points, and I select some color, notice how it applies the color. And if I were to use the gradient selection tool and I click again, notice how I have it again. I can hold down the Option key and get rid of the horizontal again, so I have just another vertical. I can select one of the anchor points We can select another color. And look at, there's no way that you can do this with the regular gradient tool. Huh? Oh, so when does this work and when does it not? In design, there is something called closed shapes and open shapes. Or like a closed gestalt and an open, well, closed and open shapes. And typically when you're designing for logos, they tell you when you make a mark, you want to create something that's like a circle, like a target. It's closed, it's like your fist. What targets do is they draw your eye to that point. Open shapes are like an open hand, that your fingers draw the viewer's eye out, and that doesn't work. Similarly, when you use this tool, there are shapes that are like that. So for example, what if I were to use the star tool, like so, and I converted this to a gradient mesh? Watch what happens. Notice how the grid followed the contour very nicely because it was a nice closed shape. If I had a square, if you looked at the petals, if you looked at the car parts, they're all basically rectangles, parallelograms. They're simple organic shapes. But look at this. This is like the fingers. The stars are like the fingers in my hand. They're drawing it out. So now when I go to Object, Gradient Mesh, see how it pushes it in weird directions? And now, to try to manipulate these points and to move it around, because maybe you just want, you want to pull these in different directions, it's really hard. Because this point is pulling this in this direction, these points are pulling them in that direction. So if you want to use a star as a shape, there's a better way to work, I think. And this is what I do. And while I'm doing this, I want to tell you about a gotcha. And the gotcha is that once you convert a shape to a gradient mesh, you can never undo it, except for your undos, wherever 20 undos you have or that sort of thing. So even if I were to come back and I were to remove all of these anchor points, and it looks like, okay, look at, he's removing them all. And I can, select the gradient mesh tool, and I can move over this line and hold down the Option key, and I can remove it. And think, okay, now I'm going to fill it with a regular gradient. It doesn't work. It still sees it as a gradient mesh. So you need to be careful. So like creating outlines with type, what I would do if you're going to convert a shape to a gradient mesh, unless it's a simple one like a circle or something, I would make a copy of it first. If you use the pen tool or use the Pathfinder tool and it took you a while to create that shape, make a copy of it first, then convert it to a gradient mesh, and if it doesn't work, then you have your other one as a backup. So my recommendation is, if you want to fill something like a star with a gradient mesh, this is what you do. You just simply create a star on top, like so, of a gradient mesh that's either a square or a circle. Those are the most basic, simple shapes. And we've done this before. You select, hold down the Shift key, and you select both shapes. And the star now is going to be a clipping mask that will allow the gradient mesh from underneath to show through, and you won't see the gradient mesh out here. So then you can add as many cross lines as you want, crossovers, and manipulate them, and it still will only, show through the star shape. So if I go to Object, Clipping Mask, Make, see how it shows through and just there? Much more control over it that way. And you can always release the clipping mask, and you can change the gradient and do what you want with it. So that's my recommendation for using it. Does that make sense? That's really all there is to it. Well, the results can be spectacular. Look at the flower, look at the car. Two really, one organic, one very mechanical, but it has its purpose. It really can, It's really pretty much the only way you can do it. Not necessarily, but you can do it more efficiently now by using that tool. Before, you would have to layer blends on top of shapes in order to get that look. And now the gradient mesh tool, which has been around for a while, is the way to go.
The fact that you can, once you customize your 2 or 3 colors and then later you can also drag it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice feature.
Yeah. So, you know, when you start to apply it, you need to a shape, you have to try to break the shapes down into simple shapes and analyze which direction the gradients are going. You might want to create a palette for yourself so you know, like with a flower, I have this range of pinks from a white to a deep pink. You know, you have for the stem, you have your range of greens that you know that when you have a string of those anchor points selected, that when you apply that color to that, it's all uniform and it will work more efficiently and you'll get better results. Okay? So that's all I wanted to talk about with regard, and the exercise that they used to have is a pretty simple one. They did the drawing for you and it's basically doing what I'm doing here. So I'm going to turn off the video player. That's all I wanted for that. Then what I wanted to do is I'm going to show the lynda.com videos on Simone. So you can, the Tokidoki guy. And see how his stuff is on La Sports Stack. It's on, you know, purses. They're expensive purses too. They're like $100, $100 and some dollars for these things. Skateboard decks, T-shirts, you name it. He is merchandises this stuff very well. So that's it. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the video, and I hope my morning one came out because the battery is going bad here.